Hello, Sales Nation. I am your host, Will Barron, and welcome to another episode of the Salesman Podcast. On this episode, we have Owen Fitzpatrick, who is an international best-selling author, globe-trotting psychologist, trainer, speaker, and he is genuinely a serious expert in the field of influence. And that is exactly what we're talking about on today's episode. We're talking about how to influence people both, and genuinely this works both in work and out of work. So both in sales and in your day-to-day conversations with friends or family or whoever it is. We're showing you how to influence through stories. There's a lot to this, and I really enjoyed our conversation together. Owen, you can find out more about him over at owenfitzpatrick.com. He's got a course called the Charisma Training Academy and also another one called Online Time Mastery. You can find them both on his website. You can find everything that we talk about, including the books, the links to Owen, his Twitter, all that kind of thing in the show notes of this episode over at salesman.red/120. And with that, let's jump into today's show. Hey, Owen, and welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
How you doing, Will? Good to see you again.
Good, man. Glad to have you on again. And today we're going to talk about stories, influence, and all that good stuff. And I'm excited about this. And massively leading question for you here, Owen. But do you think that the world of sales specifically, but business as a whole, do you think that we use stories enough day to day to influence potential customers?
Absolutely not. I think one of the most important things that you can do as a salesperson is learn to be able to impact people in a number of different ways and a number of different levels. So if you take, for example, a lot of the tried and tested, ways of selling to people, it's generally speaking very logical. So it's here's the product, here's the benefits, here it is compared to its other, competition. Here's why it's better than the competition. We expect to be able to persuade people logically. Now, the other side of things is a lot of the times we make decisions based on emotion. We justify the decision based on logic. So we see something that we want and we say, I want that because we get a feeling of desire. And that's partly affected or influenced by the brand, partly affected and influenced by our own identity, partly influenced by, the logical reasoning factors of there, such as, how much it costs, whether or not it's going to be useful for us. But a large part of the decision-making process involves our feelings. And so to me, stories are one of the most powerful ways to influence people both logically and emotionally. There's a guy called Robert McKee, who's one of the top guys, is, in my opinion, the top guy in the world in terms of teaching screenwriting and storytelling. And he has created a new sort of area called Storynomics, and he does a course on there. And what Robert does in his in the seminar and stuff is teaching people how stories themselves are the only really, really effective way of bringing together factual and logical reasoning with emotional reasoning. And if you look at the research out there, emotional reasoning is what most advertisers tend to use. Now, what they do is they'll tend to use it in the form of promising you things and, saying, if you do this, this is what your life is going to be like, or making you feel a certain way, associating all these good feelings with the brand. But if you want to truly influence people in a long-term way, I think stories are important, ridiculously important. Stories themselves are something that we've been influenced by since we were, cavemen and cavewomen. It's the oldest form of communication we have, really, because even before we learned to, use language, the anthropologists suggest that there was body language involved where each person would communicate with, the others in the group to try to, for example, warn them of dangers, etc. So storytelling to me is something that's built into our neurology, something that absolutely is the most powerful way of influencing other people. And I think the world today is starting to recognize that. All the top brands are recognizing that. It's becoming more popular. But if you ask me, I still go in to work with different companies, teaching them in terms of sales, and they still have the PowerPoint slides with the benefits, graphs, and the, here's why our product's the best, and here's why our product's the best. And people are, used to it, We're used to it.
Let me interrupt you there, Owen, because you've covered a lot of ground here, and there's a couple of things I want to go back over.
Sure.
But my experience of sales training specifically, which we should be learning how to tell stories within sales training. We can come on to that, and if there's any process or if there's any structure that we can use, that'd be awesome. But all my sales training has not been sales training. Really, it's been product training in the different companies I've been in. So in the medical device world, this endoscope has a field of view of this. Our endoscope has a field of view of this. So go to a doctor and tell him he's going to see more inside the patient when he uses our product. So instantly there's a story of, it's going to be better for the patient. It's going to be safer. There's loads of other things you can attach to it. But that was never really pitched to us to as information to sell with. So what I want to dive into, because we're going to come on to why it works and why, because you talked about then of it's the oldest form of communication. It's obviously a way to communicate with your subconscious, unconscious, whatever you want to call it, and have a deeper conversation for a story rather than this surface level analytical and logical conversation that most salespeople do each day. So we'll come on to that perhaps later on. But what I want to get really practical with all this. Is there a certain story that works to influence? Does that story have a beginning, middle, and end? Does it have a structure? Is there a way to build a story, a universal story that works with most of these? My product does this, their product does that, if that makes sense.
Sure. Okay, so what I would say is that you could argue that there is a structure, but it's quite loose in terms of there's a lot of variations of that. At a very base level, in terms of sales, most sales processes work well with what Joseph Campbell coined as the hero's journey. And the way it would work in terms of from a sales point of view is, the hero is someone for the customer to relate to. So you have to establish a hero protagonist that the hero can connect with, and the hero can go, that person's just like me. And then you have to have them facing a monster, and the monster would be whatever problem your product or service solves for them. So the monster might be, freezing cold weather. If your product is, for example, a jacket, a coat, or it might be if you're trying to, get a faster computer. So say, for example, you want to sell a fast computer. The problem might be upload or download speeds or processing speeds or whatever, and that's the monster. And so you would need a hero, a monster, which is whatever the problem is, and then a guide. And the guide would refer to the product or the salesperson themselves, giving that wisdom, giving that advice, helping the person make the decision so that they can overcome the monster. So every product that you sell, if you want to be able to storyfy it, as Robert McKee would say, you need to be able to bring the person through a journey so that they start going from once upon a time everything was okay, then they face the problem or the monster, which is, a dirty house or a very challenging. Let's say we're selling something to a company or training, a sales workforce that is not selling very effectively if we're selling sales training. Or if it's medical supplies, then, doctors are facing, a challenge in understanding what's a really reliable medication. So the problem there is the sickness and the challenge of medication not working for the sickness. Mm-hmm. And the story has to show how the protagonist, which is, the doctor in that case, or the sales team or manager or the person buying the product, how they or someone like them went through the experience of facing that problem, but with the guide, with the product, with the service, with whatever they're selling, and how that helped them overcome the problem. And so that's the loose structure that you'll find in most. There has to be a challenge or a battle or conflict between the hero and the monster, between the person themselves and the problem. Because whenever you're selling a product, the vast majority of products that you sell are designed to solve problems. You have to establish the problem. Now, at the same time, just like you'll see them do it on movies, the best thing you can do is to make the monster as horrible as possible. So you raise the stakes. If you've seen The Dark Knight, the second Batman, it was called The Dark Knight, right? So in that one, it wasn't just one bad thing happened. Something bad happened, then it got worse, then it got worse, then it got worse. And they kept raising the stakes to the point you're thinking to yourself, I don't care if he is, a hero, Batman is screwed. Now, at that moment, when Batman is able to overcome that kind of crisis, if he's able to overcome that kind of crisis, then, Batman seems so much better than he would have seen if there was a little bit. So a lot of the stories not only have a hero, a monster, and a guide. The monster needs to be pretty tough in order to show the hero is tough as well. Because if you have a hero which is perfect and then you have a monster which is kind of bad, then it doesn't really work. But if you have a monster which is destroying people and really causing problems, then you need a hero in to do that, and the hero looks better as a result once it overcomes it. So you have to have those three pieces, but then you have to think carefully on making sure that you go into the problem and you can connect with the audience. So as the audience are listening, they're going not just, oh, this is a problem the customer has, or this is a problem that I have. They also have to know it's a really bad problem with horrible, consequences. And that way they need the hero more. And when they need the guide more to be able to overcome it. And that way they become better as a result of it. Does that answer your question?
Of course it does. So there's two things to go at here. One of which we'll get more tactical with in a second, but something you mentioned then, which I've never really heard in this context before, using the salesperson, the individual who's telling the story, as the guide, you're then putting the salesperson in a position where they can add tangible value to the customer, and you're giving them a reason to deal with a salesperson rather than just order through an online order form where you've read half a story and you get the product and you get the feature and benefits. If the salesperson is tangibly the guide and will help the prospect get from solve the problem and defeat the monster themselves, then they're entwining themselves into the sales story. So I like that. I've never heard that described in that way before.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to ask you, which you've touched on here, is so if we have the story, you say it's loose. There's probably loads of other ways of storytelling, but that seems like a classic and a way that we can all relate to. Obviously, every action film ever has used that storyline. So that's awesome. I can really appreciate that, and I think most of us can put our features and benefits into that story and get something out of it that's useful. You touched on it then of making the monster worse than, or not worse than he is, but painting the picture of the monster in the worst possible way to make the story more dynamic and to drive more action from that. And what I was going to ask you was, are there any ways to influence, to drive more influence for the story? So that's obviously one. One that I thought of, and you kind of touched on as well, was to make the hero more relatable to the prospect, so they're getting wrapped up in the story. Other than those two things, how do we drive influence through these stories more so? Do we have to know things like NLP and influence tactics, or are there simpler, ways that you can share over the podcast now with the audience, practical ways that you can make these stories not just a nice story, but something that once it's told drives the person on the other end of it to really take action and want to buy the product at the end of the day?
Well, first of all, of course, there's lots of NLP tools, and anyone who's in sales, I presume, will already have read some books and learned about using NLP, some of the language patterns you can use, like, for example, quotes, where you want to give a suggestion to the customer, and inside of the story, you tell the customer what you want to tell them directly, but you do it as part of the story, and it's more.
I would honestly assume that a lot of our audience, even though they are people that are searching out a podcast like this, so they're career salespeople, they're wanting to improve their skills, I would assume a lot of them aren't that read up on NLP. Just in case you use any terms now that.
What I would say, so NLP stands for Neuro-linguistic programming. It's a way of using language to influence the mind in order to run more effectively, to impact people's feelings, etc., etc. I would certainly read up on it. And again, I won't go I want to give you practical stuff that you can do immediately. But I would read up on NLP and the use of metaphors, the use of language, when you're trying to influence people, and the use of creating certain feelings and, triggering what we call anchors, which is you create a certain feeling and you're able to link it with a particular emotion or link it with yourself. So every single time I make a person feel a certain way, I can connect that feeling with myself or connect it with my product, if I'm pointing to the product. So there's a lot in the NLP world that people should read up on. There's an awful lot of books out there. There's lots of videos online. If you're in sales, you need to know about NLP, in my opinion. But some other practical things that you can do from a storytelling point of view, as well as that, is every story positions you in some way. So, for example, if I tell you a story about this guy who, overcomes, this terrible crisis, but he does so with honesty and integrity, and he does so in that way, that not only tells you about this guy in the story who has honesty and integrity, by the very mere fact that I've chosen that story, it implies that honesty and integrity are important to me. So every time you tell a story, you're positioning yourself in some way in the audience's mind. And when you're telling a story, you allude to a number of things. The details that you allude to reveal quite a lot. So if I tell you a story, let's say I'm talking about, and the example I like to give is, let's say I want to create an image of me as being super fit. I could talk to you about, did you see the latest Star Wars? I could not believe how many people were at it. I remember I was running home from the gym the other day, and as I was going around the corner, there was a queue or a line going right, there was about 400 people in the line. It was insane. Again, cycling the next day, I came past another cinema. And so even though I'm talking about the movie, in the stories that I'm telling you, you're learning about me and you're picturing me cycling, running home from a gym. All of those images are going into your mind, which positions me in a certain way. So be aware that every time you tell a story, ask yourself the question, how am I positioned by telling this? If you're in the story, it's easy to figure that out. If you're not in the story, what kinds of values are you focusing their attention on? Because that will reveal something about you to them, and they'll start to see you more in that way as a result. So that's one thing, is positioning yourself in that particular way. Another way to be able to influence with stories is, you could, instead of using that basic structure, you could turn it on its head and you could use the cautionary tale. So you could talk about the monster who, because the hero didn't take the guide's advice, what would have happened? And so that way you're, I suppose, selling or influencing through fear. Because again, we know from decision making that some people tend to be more loss aversive. They tend to make decisions based out of fear rather than out of desire. So you can use, and in NLP terms, sometimes we talk about people have two types of motivations: towards what they do want or away from what they don't want. And so you can tell a story which positions a person so that they can imagine themselves going towards the goal, or you can tell a story of what happens to the person who makes the wrong decision, doesn't invest in your product or service, and therefore starts to find themselves dealing with the consequences of what they wanted to move away from. And by doing that, you're creating still a powerful emotion, and you're still logically bringing the message across. If you look at Harvard...
Let me just dive in there, because in the corporate world, that is the story that I've always used. So when you're dealing with surgeons, and this is only anecdotally thinking back now as you're explaining all this to me in clearer terms, but with the surgeons themselves, I'll have used the heroes versus monster story, and the surgeon comes out on top and cures cancer or whatever. With professional buyers, I would always use, what did you describe it then, of the fear story? How did you...
The cautionary
tale. I would use that because they have no real buy-in on whether the surgeon performs well or not. They have the buy-in on whether they can afford it. There's obviously an initial inertia of energy that has to be spent to change supplier. And so if they just don't care the end results, all they care about is they're going to get a massive bill in a few years because the competition that I'm trying to sell over will screw up or whatever it is. So in the corporate world, I've always found that cautionary, again, I'm only getting these terms as you're saying them at me, but it's funny looking back. The cautionary tale works better in that corporate environment, I've always found.
Yeah, well, I think it works in a lot of cases, but at the same time, it really depends on the context as well. When you're talking about health, a lot of times, if you think about it, people only go to, at least in the Western world, people only go to doctors when there's something wrong. So in a way, patients are pretty much motivated away from a health perspective. So in that context, it makes sense that a lot of the times doctors are trying to not have something happen. So therefore, they're more likely to make decisions out of what will happen if they don't make the decisions in certain contexts. But at the same time, there's still, no matter what field you're in, there's still people that are more motivated by what they have to gain and what they have to move towards. And so I think even in a corporate level, when I'm working or teaching in terms of banks or pharmaceutical companies or technology companies that I'm working with salespeople, I'm trying to get them to the point where they're very clear over their customers' wants and fears, and doing that research ahead of time so they know what does the customer want, what are their goals, and what are they scared of, what do they not want. And once they know those two things, they can formulate the story in that way. And they can, they don't have to do a once upon a time there was this person, it doesn't have to be, because that sounds condescending. It should be something that can be easy to relate to, where they talk about, a client that they worked with, or someone from another company that, went through this process, or even themselves. A lot of them, if you hear most gurus, the vast majority of all gurus use the tried and tested, my life was crap. Then, and I was facing this horrible depression, stroke, poverty, stroke, being overweight and unfit, stroke, unhealthy, stroke, anxiety. Then I learned the strategy, the tools, the techniques, the skills, etc. That's the guide, that's the answer, that's the solution. And now I own helicopters and islands, and I'm rich, and I'm good looking, and I'm thin, and I got a six-pack, or I got the most amazing figure. And you can be like that too. All you need is the guide that I got. And I'm now the guide revealing to you my secrets. And that's the standard practice that's been used for years and years and years. So again, with that kind of context, that's the desire kicking in. And that is a lot of the times in the corporate context, helping people, to buy in. If you look at, then you've got one other quick example I'll give you is the story of a company. So let's say, for example, you're talking about the corporate context of a Fortune 100 company, or a company on the stock exchange. The value of that company depends on the story. So what's happening in that story at the moment? Let's say Facebook. You figure out how much, I don't know how much shares, or how much it costs to buy a share in Facebook. But I guarantee you, if the story changed, for example, Mark Zuckerberg resigned tomorrow for Facebook, I guarantee you, the price would be severely affected. And it's because the person's story in the mind. They might operate the exact same way. In fact, maybe he steps down just as official CEO, but he still runs the place. You'll still see a marked decrease in the value of Facebook based upon the story that people have in their mind about the company. So again, the stories are everywhere, and they affect us in so many different kinds of ways.
So you brought up an interesting point then when you were talking about gurus. It's one of the reasons why I don't tend to have people on the show when they count themselves as a quote unquote guru, and that they're pushing anything that isn't tangible knowledge. So obviously you're working with loads of cool companies. You're flying around the world constantly. I was on your schedule on your website, and you're all over the place. So there's a lot to you, and I appreciate the information that you're selling and sharing on the show. But I don't have anyone on who has 6 steps to millions and all this kind of stuff, which you were talking about then. Why or when is the point where you shouldn't exaggerate with a story for a B2B salesperson? Is it okay if you were trying to put across that you were fit and healthy, which you mentioned before, if you didn't really cycle to the cinema, but you walked briskly? Is it okay to say, well, I cycled over there, and it's kind of a little white lie? Is that just a bad idea because they catch up to you in the end? Or, is there flexibility there?
To be quite honest with you, again, different people have different opinions and stuff. I always believe, you need to be as honest as you would be talking to anyone in your life. I think honesty is the best policy. I genuinely do. I think there's a lot of people that, they bullshit here or there. They make up this, scenario. They make these blatant promises. They exaggerate things. They say, Sir Richard Branson is a personal friend of mine. Well, no, he invited me personally to his island. Not exactly. You paid whatever, so much money to get to a particular place. You maybe had dinner in the same room as him. There's exaggerations like that. And I understand what people are doing it for, but I just think it's too much effort. I mean, Forget about the moral thing. I find it, my brain is so full these days with all the different things we got to, take care of if you work for yourself, especially. Trying to remember what lie you told who, and even if you're telling the same lie, trying to remember it all, it's just too much hassle. I genuinely think that you should always, you have to be have enough ingenuity to find in your own truth, in your own reality, in your own history, things that do position you in the way you want, and focus their attention on that. So direct the attention of whoever you're talking to the choice of stories you make, but avoid lying. I've heard some gurus tell stories that, Richard Bandler tells. Richard Bandler is one of the co-creators of NLP, and they tell it as if it happened to them. And I've written books with Richard, and I know, like, he's been doing this since the early 70s, and I know what happened to Richard, and these guys are, and this client happened and I did this. And that they read it out of the book, possibly even one of my books with Richard. And it's frustrating to see that, but at the end of the day, people get found out. I genuinely believe it. You have some gurus that make a packet and don't provide enough value. It's just part of the rub. They prey on people that are just, hoping for the best and hoping for, a simple, easy solution to all their problems. But at the end of the day, I sleep at night quite nicely because my focus is always on being real and being genuine about it. And it doesn't mean I'm perfect, but it's a lot less effort to not be perfect. It's a lot less effort to not have everything fixed and sorted, just to know what you do and know that you're improving all the time. And that's what I try to get across in terms of the work that I do as well,
Fantastic. And you hit a nail right in the head there. And people don't want perfect. And you can feel it in your gut when someone is bullshitting you, and you can... I don't know. You would know all about the signs and the body language and what's happening when people influence in this way. But it's just a weird, creepy thing that I can typically sense. And yeah, you can tell when a story isn't genuine. And going back to what you said of everyone has enough stories. You don't need to make stuff up. It might not be absolutely perfect, but again, I don't think, especially on the B2B corporate level, people don't need perfect. They just need good enough and real, because there's so much nonsense out there.
That's the word. And I think, honestly, I think the world is starving for real. We need, we need the reality. We need, people to be telling us genuinely what's going on for them. We need to feel that they're being 100% themselves. To me, the most important part of being effective at sales is authenticity and is being real and being yourself. You obviously need to express yourself. You need to be passionate about what you're talking about. You need to be playful and to be able to engage people. You need to demonstrate confidence. They're all absolutely critical skills for a salesperson. But if you're not real, if you're like, putting on this act where you're like super happy and all that, people read it, and it gets annoying. If I walk into a place and someone's like, all, happy and that's not, if it's really them, you can tell the difference. But if they're being like that, I'm just like, I just feel like, all they're seeing is an open cash register, and they're faking it and in a way lying to me. I actually think when people are pretending to be super nice and pretending this and pretending that, and I actually see that as lying. And that doesn't mean that if you're naturally kind of grumpy person that you go in and you treat people rudely or whatever. You need to basically build up some social skills and start changing your priorities and changing what your values, what you're valuing in that, and start to realize that you've got to help the customer out, but do it in a real way, because, in Ireland, it's not that much of a problem, to be honest. In Ireland, there's not really much of that faking going on. We have our own challenges in terms of some of the parts of our persona or natural personality issues that we have, but fakeness is not one of them. We're pretty real in that way, and that's also why so many people, when they come to Ireland, they say they're the friendliest, loveliest people. It's not because we're like super nice or suit and animated. You'll never get Irish people going, "Hello, how are you?" They're much more relaxed, much more cynical, much more chilled out, but it's real, and that's what people feel, I think.
Definitely. Well,
except for Conor McGregor, he wouldn't be as low as that, but he's still a legend, so it's all good.
For sure. Well, I've got a couple of questions I wrap up every show with. This first one, going back to being real, we'll dive into this. What motivates you to close deals? What drives you?
Okay, so for me, if I'm deciding whether or not to take on work, so I would get quite a lot of offers of work, and so I'm not saying money isn't important. It is, and I have my fees and stuff and whatever, but it's not the most important thing. In fact, it wouldn't even be in the top three. For me, the top three things that would drive me or get me excited about anything is, number one, ownership. or creativity, something that I can do my own way in using my own creativity. If I get to be creative in a way that I enjoy and I get ownership over it, then it's something that, I'm interested in. Number two, if it challenges me, if it's difficult, if it's hard, if it looks like it's impossible, the more it is, the more I want to do it. So that's a huge thing for me. And then the third would probably be progress. I would need to feel that by doing it, I'm better at something in some way that I want to be better at. So I would need to see it as something that I'm better at as a result of doing it. So if it has ownership, creativity, if it has something that challenges me, and if it's something that I believe will make me better at something, they're the three things that I look. Fun is also important. Money, as I said, is important to a degree. There's other factors that are important, but those would be the top three for me.
That, Owen, is the best answer that I've had to this question in a long time. Most people come on and they give some kind of nonsense about, well, I just like making my customers happy and yada, yada. So I have to ask another 4 or 5 questions and ask why so many times to get to the bottom of it. But it seems like you've really thought about this, thought about what work you take on. You've got those tick boxes. And that's really fascinating to me.
Well, just on that, one of the things that I teach sort of 12 motivational drivers that motivate us to work. And it's one of the core models that I use, and it's something I spent and created. So that's why it's so clear to me what they are, because I've gone over this over and over again. But also, a lot of times people, when they give you answers like, I just want to make the customer happy, I understand that, I get that, and I know it's true. And I too really want to make sure the customer is happy. But at the same time, there's lots of different ways to do that. And if you ask me what the things that make me excited about work are, those are the things. Making an impact, sure, makes a difference. Helping people, sure, makes a difference. But I want to be doing something that, ascribes to those three things as well.
Yeah, well, if someone wants to make a customer happy, it's not because they want to make someone else happy. It's because they want the feedback from the customer generally saying, oh, you've done really well, and getting their ego stroked. So that's why I have to ask these questions. And you've obviously got this nailed. And a last one from me, Owen. You answered this last time, but I don't know if you can remember your answer. I'll check back and see after we record this. But if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at sales?
Yeah, I remember you asking me, but I have no idea what I answered. I would say now, based upon what I had already said, I would say, be yourself as fully as possible. So whoever that is, let your personality shine out. Avoid trying to do what everyone else tells you should do. Because the advice I got for years was, you need to be clean cut, you need to be, serious and, motivational and all that. And it's just not me. I've got a dark sense of humor. I'm pretty sarcastic. And so it was only when I started to embrace that and started to be my cynical self, even though I'm optimistic and I'm positive, when I started to be myself, that's when people, related to me better and connected. So I would say, although it's a bit of a platitude now, be yourself, I genuinely think being yourself is so important. I would say get to involve yourself in stories as much as possible and make the whole process fun. Because again, at the end of the day, the more fun you can make it, the more motivated you'll be, and the more likely you'll be able to sell. And the last thing would be, study the audience, know who you're talking to, and make sure that you're framing it with them in mind. One of the things I was talking about recently at a seminar is I was talking about positioning yourself and how to position yourself. And the very first thing that I taught them was the audience. And people were like, what? This is about you. You do the audience as a separate section. I said, you want to position yourself? You need to know where they positioned you already, because it's not a blank slate. So always be aware of your audience. How do they think about you? How do they feel about you now? And how do you want them to think and feel about you? And they would be the 3 pieces of advice I give. Be authentic, be yourself, make it fun and enjoy the process, use stories. And then lastly, study the audience, know who you're talking to. And hopefully that answer isn't too far away from, hopefully my advice last time was be fake, use logic, and, focus on yourself. Because that would be pretty embarrassing.
I'm going to look back now. I'm intrigued myself. But with that, Owen, I want you to tell us a little bit more about where the audience can find out more about you and the different things you've got going on as well.
Sure. I'm I'm not in the internet, but I'm on the internet, www.owenfitzpatrick.com. On there's a blog where I have lots of different articles about all sorts of stuff. I've also a YouTube channel where if you type my name into YouTube, Owen Fitzpatrick, you'll find all these sort of quirky type videos, a thing called the Sarcastic Series, which is a fun way of learning different things. I've got a few books out, The Charismatic Edge. You can find it again, a few books on NLP with Dr. Richard Bandler, who's a really amazing mentor of mine. And you can find them on Amazon. What else? Oh, yeah, and I've got an online Charisma Training Academy. This is an online program where you get access to it. And again, that's on charismatrainingacademy.com. And I'm also on time management, onlinetimemastery.com, which is information. Lastly, I'm on Facebook, Owen Fitzpatrick International. I would love if you like my page. And if you like my page, I promise you, you'll feel good because you'll be, able to see any latest notices or, blog posts or videos or any of that sort of stuff that's coming up. I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on all the social media thingamajigs. But yeah, that's pretty much the majority of everything.
We'll link to all that in the show notes for this episode over at salesman.red. And with that, Owen, a fascinating chat again. You're more welcome to come back on in the future for sure. And I want to thank you for spending time with us today on the Salesman Podcast.
Thanks a lot, Will. Always a pleasure.
And there we have it. Thank you, Owen, for coming on. I appreciate it, mate. I appreciate our little conversations about how our friend Conor McGregor is doing both sides of every recording that we do. I appreciate that, mate. And yeah, I appreciate you, the audience, as always, for tuning in. I say it all the time. There'd be no show without you guys. So I massively appreciate your time. And with that, I'll speak with you again tomorrow.